a dogma lesson, just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology.
Hello and welcome to TEFLology. This is our second special interview episode featuring two interviews, both conducted by Matt and Rob at the second International Symposium on Native-Speakerism earlier this month at Saga University in Japan. The first interview is with Professor Stephanie Ann Houghton, who is the organizer of the symposium and is also the author of books on intercultural communication and the concept of Native-Speakerism. Matt and Rob met up with her before the symposium began. Enjoy!
Okay, so Stephanie Ann Houghton is an associate professor in intercultural communication at Saga University, Japan. She holds a PhD in education from Durham University in the UK. She is author of several books and papers and recently co-edited the book Native-Speakerism in Japan, Intergroup Dynamics in Foreign Language Education with Damien Rivers. She is also the organiser of the second International Symposium on Native-Speakerism, where we're meeting her today. So first of all, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed by us.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Just for our listeners, some of our listeners might not be aware or unfamiliar with the concept of Native-Speakerism. Perhaps could you give us a brief overview of the idea of Native-Speakerism?
Yes, okay. So let's see. So I came to Japan in 1993 and I was an ALT for 3 years.
Right.
And at that time, ALTs could only stay for 3 years and then they had to leave, which is a policy I didn't question at the time.
Right.
And then later when I came to work at the university level, I noticed the same policy was in operation, that foreigners would stay for a couple of years and then they would have to leave, which was the case at one of my previous universities. And but I thought that at the time it was very much connected with the fact that I was a native speaker and people around me affected by the policy were native speakers of either English or Korean. And that also that was connected with a wide range of associated prejudices, which is what I thought. But at that time I was really kind of struggling to understand the predicament that I found myself in, and I couldn't find a word to describe it because the people at the university were not saying that you're employed on these terms because you're a foreigner. They were saying it's because you're a native speaker.
Oh, right, okay.
And so I was rather stuck for language to use to describe and understand my situation. And then I came across Adrian Holliday's book, The Struggle to Teach English, and he used the word native-speakerism in connection with the prejudices associated with the employment of non-native speaker teachers. Right. So that's the starting point, is that non-native speaker teachers have been complaining for many, many years about discrimination against them, whereas we, the inverted commas, native speakers, are given preferential treatment. And so what Damien and I wanted to do, as both British people, we wanted to do in the book that we co-edited was to try to expand Adrian Holliday's definition to also include native speakers as objects, targets of prejudice.
I see.
So the ism, like the same suffix as in racism, sexism, so prejudice against native speakers, but also against non-native speakers. So prejudice against people based on whether or not they are native speakers.
Yes.
That's the idea behind it.
Yeah, that was actually a question we were going to ask, that in the book there seems to be an argument, not just that native speakers, non-native speakers are discriminated against, but also that native speakers are discriminated against. How have you encountered that in your career?
Yes, well, it's been in the teaching of English as a foreign language only, and I've only personally experienced it in Japan. Firstly, at the high school level. I also, have seen the kind of same dynamics in operation at English language schools when I was involved with the labour union from Fukuoka. Right. And then very much at the university level.
Okay. And what do you think drives that? What do you think drives the differential treatment of native and non-native speakers?
Well, I think this system has a long history, which goes back over 100 years to when the Gaikokujin Kyoshu were employed in the very early days of English language education in Japan.
And that was a particular contract term that was
Yes, I
used at
think
the time.
native speakers were systematically brought into the country, and they were paid a little bit more than people around them, but it was a fixed term and it was non-renewable, and so they had to leave after a certain time. That's the basic concept that's in operation, I think. And I think over time, basically that became connected with the idea of citizenship. And so at some point that kind of became institutionalised into governmentally sanctioned practice by law.
I see.
Especially at national universities, public universities, government-run universities. So they would only employ citizens as civil servants. And so the citizenship requirement effectively meant that non-citizens could not be employed on the same terms as the civil servants, the public servants. Except that they did introduce a law to employ gaikokujin kyoin. But they were employed on slightly different terms to the people, the mainstream staff.
I see.
But I think in 2005 that system was abolished. And so at that point we were able at my university at the time to persuade them to change the system to allow us more comparable, not completely comparable, more comparable terms of employment.
And obviously you've been talking about Japan a lot. In the book Native-Speakerism in Japan, there's one chapter about the situation in Italian universities.
Yes.
Do you think this is a problem that is very widespread around the world?
Yes, I do, very much so, yes. The difference between Japan and Italy is that in Italy the teachers there have the protection of European law, which we don't have in Asia. There's no corresponding Asian law. And definitely that group of lettori, they're called the lecturers, I think the last count they had won 6 court cases against the Italian government in the European court. But still the situation is ongoing and it hasn't been completely resolved. But that's a particularly egregious case. But certainly when I talk to people, going around at conferences and from different countries, you can find very, very similar patterns. And especially in Asia, the Korea and China, Shanghai are 2 cases in point that I can think of, Hong Kong. But I don't think anybody has researched it. So I think the fact that we're focusing on problems of native speakers is very, very new still.
And do you think you've been talking about the legalities of it, particularly in Japan? Do you think that there's more of an ideological underpinning there as well, producing these conditions?
Ideological. In what sense do you mean exactly?
So in the sense that, for example, perhaps Western native speakers, Western in inverted commas, Western native speakers are seen as the representatives of a particular language model, a particular cultural group, but not quite so much as professionals in the same way that their non-native speaking counterparts are.
Yes, generally speaking, I think that's the case. Yes, certainly I think the native speaker model is very, very strong in Japan. But in the book that we co-edited, there was an interesting chapter by Ryoko Tsuneyoshi from the University of Tokyo. And she argued that it's not just that, it's also a question of what the individuals concerned are identified for particular purposes. And so, for example, if you have a university that has a big conference and they want an expert to come from, I don't know, some country, and they invite that person on the professional basis, their academic knowledge and expertise, then they would be identified for that, and these dynamics wouldn't come into play. But if they're employing teachers who are supposed to be representing the culture to be models for the students, then in those cases, and those cases are very, very common, that's where the ideological things that you just talked about would come into play, I think.
Okay, so how do you think perhaps universities or other institutions could go about trying to resolve these problems or tackle these problems?
Well, for me, one dimension is the university employment policy itself, and I think that's very much connected with the use of the Japanese language for administrative purposes. So the big problem that I see that I don't think is going to be resolved is the fact that very, very few people from other countries who've lived here for many years, including me, are able or capable of reaching the level of Japanese in all 4 skills to function at university level in academic contexts fluently enough that it doesn't cause any discomfort to the people around them. I know very few people who achieve that level, but really that's the only thing that's going to help people integrate in some circumstances. So the question of what to do about that is something that universities have to address. And it's not an easy answer. I mean, some universities introduce the use of English-only universities or a bilingual policy. But even if it's bilingual, you have the code switching, the power struggles that can come into play there need addressing. So it's very much to do with the ideology of the university, what they want to prioritise, how deeply, whether or not they're going to be international just when they step out of the door into another country, or whether they're going to be international in their own working environment. So that's one dimension. The other dimension, which I think is easier to work with and important to work with, is what we teach the students, who are the next generation. And so the purpose of the symposium, partly, or largely, is to try to find pedagogical solutions to the fact that the native speaker concept is still so strong here and in other places, and that the native speaker is idolised in an unhealthy way, because it's a kind of a standard that nobody can reach, and it's not desirable to reach it in any case. So I was looking for alternative pedagogical approaches. So I found that in the 3 areas of intercultural communication, which prioritises communication between people of different cultures, regardless of where they're from. And then secondly, through English as a lingua franca, which recognises that the English language is the global language of the current times, but is far less likely to be used with native speakers than it is with non-native speakers. And the important point is that people have to, including the native speakers, everybody has to be ready to communicate with anybody from any other country in the world in English, regardless of the accent, and they have to be prepared to try to overcome the communicative barriers that might arise and the cultural issues that might arise. So English as a lingua franca looks at the kind of language that's used when non-native speakers and maybe native speakers are communicating. And the third one is in world Englishes. And so for me at least, as far as I can see, that seems to be looking at the different varieties of English that are used in different parts of the world, and that the way those varieties are used as vehicles for cultural expression locally. So I think there's some importance there for preserving cultural diversity. So in my view, English as lingua franca tends to push out the cultural diversity, whereas world English tends to protect it. And both of those are important. So I'm interested myself into trying to blend the important aspects of those 3 fields into something new, some new form of pedagogy which is more suitable for current times.
Are there any materials, like classroom materials, available for students and teachers that kind of promote these trends?
Yes. Well, the area that I'm most familiar with is intercultural communication. And as that applies to English, as that applies to foreign language education, that tends to be called intercultural communicative competence. As an expansion of communicative competence. And I myself have made so many materials for my own classes over the years, and I've been desperately trying to find publishers for the last couple of years, and it's almost impossible. They're just not interested. And so I don't think that, I don't know, I'm still looking for a way. It's very, very difficult to persuade mainstream international publishers to take these ideas on board as the central concepts of textbooks, not just as individual components or tasks that might be added on around the edges. And as for English as a lingua franca, people who don't know about the ideas behind that whole field, they might look at the English that's being used and say, oh, well, it's just full of mistakes. And so publishers with that kind of point of view might not want to publish textbooks which are full of mistakes. And I don't think, as far as I know, I can't think of any textbooks that have been published to teach English as a lingua franca as such. But World Englishes, Andy Kirkpatrick published a nice textbook, but it's very thick and it's aimed at people who are already highly fluent in the language. So what to do about those lower levels is a big challenge.
I came across one textbook by, I think it was Nobuyuki Honna.
Yes.
I think the name of it was Understanding English as a Global Language. It was kind of had a black cover. But the topic was all about English in Japan and English in the world, but it was directed at English learners in Japan. But it was more of a discussion textbook about the issues with English. I thought that was quite an interesting take on the idea. But it didn't actually, like you said, it didn't incorporate any of these world English.
In terms of teaching world Englishes, obviously there are lots of different varieties of English around the world. How could, or do you have any ideas about how you could raise awareness of all of those different varieties, or would there be a level of prioritisation involved in selecting which varieties you're going to tell the students about and so on?
Well, exactly.
Right.
Down to practicalities. Yes. Yes, I think probably the best case to look at is Chukyo University, which is in Japan, and I think Jim D'Angelo.
I think that's how you pronounce it.
I think he was one of the authors on the book I was just talking about, actually.
Quite possibly.
Right.
Yes, yeah. But I think they've been developing a World Englishes programme.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know, I can't remember the detail of exactly what they teach, but it does include a study abroad component, as far as I'm aware. But the question, as you say, is which varieties you choose to teach. So partly, because I interviewed a lot of people about this, and one aspect is just trying to raise awareness that other forms of English exist. So that can be done through discussion. Then the question is whether you teach certain forms, which forms you prioritise over others. And I myself don't feel qualified to teach the kind of English that would be used in, I don't know, South Africa, for example. But that's the other point, is that teachers themselves are not necessarily equipped to teach all of the varieties of English that you can find in the world. So there's a great there's a need for the teachers themselves to become very flexible and to be able to adapt to teaching forms of English that they don't know about, in order to raise the students' awareness and just to give them a taste of other languages. But I don't know whether anybody is actually trying to teach a whole codified form of English in a certain part of the world, but I think it's quite possible. For example, in Russia, it's quite possible that some teachers or professors who ascribe to that point of view are actually teaching what they think is Russian English to their students rather than native English or standard English. Right.
Yeah, it's. I think maybe this is something which is not just with perhaps more or less well-known varieties of English, but even with, say, British English and American English. I think a lot of, for example, British teachers or Australian teachers, when they travel around the world, they end up teaching standard American English and then teaching their own variety of the language as another option for the students, making them aware there's this form as well. Yeah, so I think it's quite interesting how we can try to teach all those things.
Yeah, but actually now you say it, I don't know, just reflecting on my experience of living in Japan, maybe I thought for many years I was teaching standard English. But now I think maybe I wasn't.
Right.
And that what I was actually using was English as a lingua franca.
Okay.
So the question is how do you define and distinguish these different forms? But certainly, today at least, having lived here for a very long time, today at least I definitely do have a mode of English that I use with people in this environment, which does not include colloquialisms from Britain. It doesn't include slang. It involves speaking more slowly, listening a lot more than I would, that kind of thing, using different kinds of communication strategies perhaps. But definitely cutting out a lot of the words and concepts that are going to just be unnecessary and causing confusion in the person I'm talking to. And I gave the example of the ELF conference last year, when I went to Rome. Before I went to Rome, I was on my way back to Britain as well. And when I left Japan, I started thinking about going to the pub. And I was really looking forward to having half a bitter top and a packet of quavers. But then when I was in Rome and I was talking about English as a lingua franca, I said, if somebody asked me in Japan, what are you looking forward to most about going back to Britain? I wouldn't say that I just said to you. I would say something like, I'm looking forward to going to a pub and having a glass of beer and a packet of potato chips.
Right.
Yeah.
And part of it is that I know that the people are going to understand it. And part of it is I don't want my lovely image of the half a bitter top and the quavers ruined by having to deconstruct it. I want to keep the flavour and smell of it and everything completely intact in my mind. So actually I find I kind of withhold it to protect something that's valuable to me. That makes sense.
That's interesting, that idea of withholding in language. That's quite interesting.
I wonder, I guess people coming from other countries and speaking of the varieties of English might have the same reaction and the same idea, I guess.
Maybe. I think it's worth thinking about.
Yeah. Well, maybe as we're here at the symposium, perhaps you'd like to give our listeners a flavour of what is going to be happening at this symposium.
Okay. So the symposium is spread over 2 days. Altogether, there are about 50 people involved, and I think the first plenary session is by Enric Llurda from University of Lleida in Catalonia, in Spain, and he wrote a famous book about the problems faced by non-native speakers, and he was very keen to come. The next plenary speaker after that will be John Mayer, who's from ICU University in Tokyo and also from Oxford University, looking at the native speaker concept itself and trying to deconstruct it a little bit. Andy Kirkpatrick unfortunately can't come. And then Nobuyuki Hino is going to look at the problems that we discuss from the perspective of World Englishes, trying to promote a particular pedagogical approach that he's been developing over many years. Then other than that, we have basically 3 strands. One strand is focusing on the problems faced by native speaker teachers. So in that strand, there are various teacher narratives that are going to be shared, problems people have faced in different contexts. For example, not only just as employees, but also as people, for example, who served on interview panels, who are familiar with the kind of secret criteria that go on in the employment process. So that's looking at the employment and the problems faced by native speakers. The second part of the symposium moves away from English and focuses on the teaching of Japanese as a foreign language by Japanese native speakers. And how native-speakerism as a concept manifests itself in the teaching of that particular language. And I think that that's rooted in Kayoko Hashimoto's research. So Kayoko is the 3rd member of our research team on the funded project, the Kakehi project, that is supporting this symposium. So she's Japanese but lives in Australia and has Australian citizenship, and she was researching the employment of teachers of Japanese as a foreign language on the EPA programme, Economic Partnership Agreement. Where the Japanese government employs care workers, nurses, care workers from the Philippines and other Asian countries to come to Japan. And what she found basically was that the native speakerism in the teaching of Japanese largely mirrors that of native speakerism in the teaching of English. She found very similar dynamics. So those are the 2 like fundamental strands, if you like, which are looking at the problems in the teaching of the 2 languages. And then the 3rd strand is a more solution-oriented approach. That's looking at the kinds of pedagogy that we can develop to try to move people away from this reliance on the native speaker as model for language learners.
It sounds very interesting, particularly the strand about Japanese language education. Do you think this is something that could maybe be expanded into other contexts? So obviously your research takes place largely in Japan, the symposiums in Japan. Do you know of anything that's happening in other countries or in other situations?
Yes. In the teaching of French as a foreign language by French native speakers. There's a lady from a university in Paris called Martine de Rivry, and she has been researching this problem, looking at job advertisements and interviewing people, taking partly a quantitative approach, not just qualitative. In recognition of the problem and trying to understand it. And then we had in April this year, we had the first symposium on native speakerism at the University of Durham in England, and Kathy Peck, who used to work in South Korea, made a presentation about how native speakerism manifests itself in that context. What I realised then was it really is contextually based. And so one reason why I feel confident enough to research this issue here in Japan is because I'm very familiar with the context. But of course, even South Korea, it's just across the water, but very, very different context. And it made me feel a little more cautious about rushing too fast into researching it outside Japan. But definitely, I think there's plenty there to research. And it's important to people, because it really affects people's lives. It affects their careers and their sense of stability and their sense of self-confidence and all sorts of different aspects of life. So
Well, thinking about the personal effects of native speakerism, obviously it was a term that was coined to describe the problems faced by non-native speakers. Have you had any kind of criticism or complaints about using the same term to talk about problems faced by native speakers? Has there been any objections to that raised?
No, except when we initially sent the manuscript to Monolingual Matters, and it was sent out for external review. one of the anonymous external reviewers really slammed the book.
Right.
But it was part of the review process, and so we were able to tackle those criticisms. Eventually, the book did get published.
Yeah.
So I don't know who that was. But no, overwhelmingly, the response has been very positive so far, and yes, yeah. But who knows? I'm sure there are people out there who object, but I don't know.
Right. And do you think that the problems faced by non-native speakers and native speakers are equally serious within the field?
Well, for me at least, discrimination is discrimination.
Right.
The question is whether it's acceptable discrimination or not. And if people are being discriminated against because they're native speakers or non-native speakers, it's not acceptable. So in that sense, it's equal.
Right.
It's just that, I don't know. I mean, in Japan is rather a special case in the sense that there are so many foreigners who are brought in from countries around the world systematically to teach as native speakers.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's a government-sanctioned approach means it's very, very difficult to tackle it because people don't see it as being wrong. And the people involved in the teaching process and education are not necessarily aware of the kind of patterns which are unfolding in other parts of the world.
Right.
Yeah.
I remember a story about someone who we used to work with who was cycling. It was maybe 25 years ago, and he was riding along the street, and a guy stopped him and went, "Excuse me, are you American?" And he went, "Yes, I'm American." Like, "Oh, would you like to be a tenured professor at our university?" And obviously he took the job. I'd like to think things have changed. Perhaps.
When we met him 25 years later, he still was the
Right.
tenured professor.
Yeah.
But I think that highlights the distinction between the situations of native and non-native speaking teachers.
Right, yeah.
In that I think the main hurdle, one main hurdle that non-native speakers often face is at the employment stage. They find it difficult to get the job in the first place.
Yeah.
Whereas native speakers maybe get over that hurdle a little bit more easily, but once they're in, then their working environment is affected in ways that maybe wouldn't be affected by non-native speakers. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think Diane Hawley-Nagatomo, in her book, she made a comment that most native speakers in Japanese universities tend to be on the periphery in these 5-year contracts, and then they move around in a case of musical jobs, every 5 years.
Yes.
Whereas, as you said, the Japanese non-native speakers they find it more difficult to enter those programs, but they find it much more easy to gain tenured professorship and so on. And so we've talked a lot about the contracts and so on. Do you think there's a difference in the kind of work that's assigned to native and non-native speakers based on native speakers?
Yes. I think basically Adrian Holiday looks at that in some detail, and other writers who were complaining about the situation of non-native speakers were highlighting the way that native speakers tend to be put into communication-oriented classes, and Japanese teachers tend to be put into more grammar-oriented, reading, translation-based classes. That's often the divide. So the reasons for that, on the one hand, it could be that they think that native speakers are more able to communicate, but also it could be that the Japanese teachers don't want to speak English. Right.
Yeah. Could it be a cultural thing as well? The native speakers are expected to represent a culture. So I've been asked to teach British culture classes and that kind of thing before. Do you think that's also part of it?
Yes, although certainly the university where I used to be employed had lots of Japanese tenured professors who were really expert, had expert knowledge of British culture.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'd just like to say thank you very much for giving us the time today to tell us a bit more about the concept of Native-Speakerism. And we look forward to attending the symposium too, tomorrow and Tuesday.
Yeah, and good luck with the symposium. I hope it all goes well.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Jeff, for coming, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed the interview with Professor Stephanie Ann Houghton. Our second interview for this episode is with Dr. Enric Llurda. Dr. Llurda was one of the plenary speakers at the symposium, and his research interests include non-native teachers' identities, and language attitudes. He has also contributed strongly to the field of English as a lingua franca. Matt and Rob met Enric after his plenary address and spoke to him about some ideas raised in his presentation.
Okay, so we're joined here by Enric Llurda from the University of Lleida in Catalonia, Spain. Enric teaches courses on language and applied linguistics. He's the editor of a book on non-native language teachers, and is also a co-author of 2 books in Spanish, one on language awareness and the other on language education. He's also published several articles in international journals too, and his current research interests include non-native language teachers, English as an international language, language attitudes and language policy. Enric, thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed by us today.
Thank you.
And first of all, Rob would like to start the questions.
Okay, so you gave the plenary address here at the, or one of the plenary addresses at the Second International Native-Speakerism Symposium yesterday. Could you give us a brief overview of what you were talking about in the plenary?
Okay, I'll try. I'll do my best to summarize what I said. Basically, what I was trying to do is to bring 4 concepts in that I think are relevant in the discussion of native speakerism and the role of teachers in a contemporary, in the moment where we are now, and what these 4 topics, these 4 ideas that I wanted to bring together were, on the first hand, was the native non-native teacher debate, discussion, controversy, whatever, and what we have seen also from especially the literature, looking at what it means to be a native speaker, what it implies, whether there is a basis or foundation for separating native non-native and on what grounds, and also specifically referring to Alan Davies' idea that we need to distinction native speakers as people in real life from the native speaker idealized or the native speaker idea that's sort of taken sometimes as a general idea, as a general element for determining who is a good teacher, who may be hired or not, and it's determining many other aspects also. So this idealized vision of the native speaker, which doesn't correspond to real people, it's more like an abstract idea, is what I think is relevant because it's what is determining this native speakerism that was described by Holiday, and it's the reason for this symposium. This was the first idea, the first topic. The second was bringing in English as a lingua franca, or English as an international language, and what I think is the importance of this area of research, also to conceptualize and to realize that the role of teachers of English nowadays is different, for example, from what it could be the role for teachers of let's say Swedish, in which really they would be aiming at, maybe communicating with Swedish people. Nowadays, the role of English as lingua franca, means that you learn English for a variety of purposes, and meet different people, different situations. I also wanted to touch upon intercultural communication, intercultural communicative competence, as proposed originally by Michael Byram and elaborated later by several other people. Because I think that one of the questions that we have is that, okay, when we talk about native, non-natives, there's always this discussion or this idea that, well, natives, provide a solid knowledge of culture. But when we look at English as lingua franca, the term culture becomes much more complex than, it's normally complex, but it becomes even more complex. And we cannot relate English to any particular competence, I think, and probably what we need to do is to make sure that we are interculturally competent users, speakers, and help our students be so. Having said this is an element that often is associated, with having a solid knowledge of the culture to native speakers, but having an intercultural competence, a lot of people might think, well, this is more something that non-native speakers have, and I try to explain that this has nothing to do with being a native or a non-native. It has to do with many other aspects, like having had really a will to communicate with people in other places, moving around. So having experience abroad was an important element, etc. But I think that's an important aspect. And finally, I touched upon the notion of the language user, which was proposed by Vivian Cook originally, and tried to make a claim for the importance to dissociate the learner, people who perceive themselves as learners, and people who perceive themselves as users. And this is important in the sense that, of course, I mean, when you start learning a language, you are a learner of the language, but at some point you become mature, you become sort of an adult, so to speak, and you are a user. You can speak the language, you can use it, and at that point, I think you are not so much relying on the teacher or on the expert or maybe on the native, but you are relying on your own intuition, your own expertise, your own experiences. And my point was also that sometimes teachers, and non-native teachers particularly, which is my focus of interest, even though they are proficient users, they don't incorporate this idea of feeling a user, because they still, feel that they have the obligation to protect the original model of language, associated to the native speaker ideal. And so my interest is in changing these perceptions, and help teachers realize that they are users and that their goal is to help students become users. So I would say that that's basically the idea in my talk.
Okay, and so maybe going back to the first point that you mentioned about the idealized model of the native speaker and how that doesn't match up to the reality of actual individuals. What professional issues do you think the use of that concept causes for both groups, native and non-native speaker teachers?
Professional issues caused by the differentiation between native speaker ideal and native speaker people?
Yes.
I think that a lot of the actual decisions on hiring people, for example, or on taking sometimes decisions in certain aspects of life involving English are based on this idealized notion of the native speaker. Once you realize that English is a language used by people, in many contexts, many circumstances, with different accents, with different, backgrounds, I think that takes a lot of pressure from the people who use English, and it also opens the gate to more diversity of options. So sometimes policymakers have just a single model, single way of acting, which is purely based on this abstraction, which doesn't correspond to real life. So, and then the translation, for example, in teaching would be like, okay, a private school in Korea wanting specifically native speakers. For what reason? I mean, and do they care whether the native speakers are trained teachers? Do they care whether they have, their speaking is intelligible? They have, they have, the competences to teach, or whatever. Well, that seems to be a secondary. Where I think that should be an important thing. And of course, I mean, you need to have teachers who can speak English. And if they have, a lot of native speakers have traveled a lot. I mean, for one reason or another, I mean, British, particularly young people, seem to be quite good at traveling when they are young, as compared maybe to other countries. So that's a plus. No question about that.
Right. I just have one question. So you call for ELF Intercultural Competence to be the new, perhaps a replacement model for the native speaker. Could you briefly explain how that could be achieved? An interculturally competent teacher, for example.
Well, what I say is that, I mean, for me, a good teacher should have, first, should be an English as lingua franca user. So basically, I mean, let's take a native speaker. There are many kinds of native speakers, and you can have an educated native speaker, but then you can have a native speaker could be somebody, like who's born in a specific place, who, his speaking is quite intelligible in the local context, but not so much outside that. So that should be somebody with English as lingua franca. I mean, somebody who has some skills that, making the speech intelligible, and sort of having a knowledge of what kind of aspects of English that he uses will be more intelligible, and what others will not be. He was able maybe to leave aside all localisms and focus to a more open, wider audience. And somebody who is interculturally competent. Somebody who has openness to diversity, who has experience of different world context, even in the society, their own society, different situations. So I think that basically a big open mind is relevant, so that in a way we can, I mean, following the idea of Michael Byram, I mean, part of the idea when you teach a language, I mean, you are helping this person when you teach English, but when you teach any other foreign language, you're helping this person become a world citizen. And I think that should be, and that's probably one of the goals of language teaching, right? So,
Perhaps it would help our listeners to understand this a little better if you maybe described or defined what you mean by ELF, because as we spoke about earlier, there are a few different conceptions, and I think you used a very useful analogy of ELF as a boat as opposed to a bridge during your talk.
Right. In my talk, I draw this metaphor, and which I was thinking, okay, well, English, foreign language, but English particularly has often been considered a bridge. It's a bridge that links, people at different shores, like people living in two islands, and they're connected by this bridge. But on thinking about this concept, I thought, well, this is an idea that reflects the traditional vision of English as a foreign language. So English as a native language, English as a language that belongs to a group of native people. So we are drawing a bridge between us, whoever we are, Japanese, Korean, Catalan, French, to them, whoever they are, British or American or Australian. And therefore we have this very specific model that we are aiming at, and our goal is to reproduce, imitate that model. Whereas the idea of English and lingua franca opens a lot more freedom, because, and in a way, the metaphor that comes to my mind is that of a boat, and with a boat you can leave your island, and then you can head towards any other place, and you can go here, there, many different places. And also the metaphor was useful because the boat can take different shapes. I mean, you can have a boat that's very flourished, and others are more aimed at specific purposes. Often, I mean, some users of English lingua franca do so for very specific purposes, medical, conventions, whatever. Or business. I thought that this was a useful image to reflect what we mean by English lingua franca. Getting back also to one of the discussions at the symposium, English lingua franca sometimes has been regarded or sort of represented as something like, okay, people who are trying to come up with a new model for teaching, with a new sort of unified variety of English. And I think that that's a little bit of a misconception, as most scholars in English as lingua franca think of English lingua franca not as a variety, but as a as a sort of an opening of barriers and a flexibility that allows for multiple ways of speaking, accepts diversity, multilingualism, code switching, and basically it's all this composes English lingua franca, or ELF.
Just talking about your own background, being Catalan, you talked about some problems with. So if we think about native-speakerism, and we think about Spain, you said you used the analogy of flamenco dancing in Barcelona, and people naturally put the two and two together. But you said that there isn't an actual match in the two, actually. And I just wonder, is your own experience of being both Catalan and Spanish and having two identities, how does that feed into your...
I think that has helped me a lot in understanding things about language and culture. Because my documentation says I'm Spanish, but over the years I've developed a Catalan identity. I mean, I was born in Catalan, but I mean, if anything, I realized that I have, a Catalan identity, but also quite strongly connected to my context, immediate context, which is Spain. But then I feel very much or very little identified with a lot of the immediate associations that people may make when I say, okay, I come from near Barcelona, right? And people may immediately say Barcelona, Spain, and then all the stereotype associations of culture with Spain, bullfighting, flamenco. Well, it happens, all those not to be common, and I thought that was a good illustration of the complexity of culture and how it's irrelevant to say, okay, well, this people comes from Britain, so he will be an expert in British culture. Well, what do we mean for British culture, right? So we need to approach culture from this more intercultural perspective.
Right. And as you said, maybe teachers can gain awareness of that through travel, learning.
or travel or internet, or but experiencing diversity,
I had one question. Do you think a monolingual teacher can also be interculturally competent, or do they go against each other, the two?
I guess they can, but I think it's more difficult. Monolingual, yeah. See, but since you raised this term, I think it's important also to look at something that typically, and I myself, I probably have done so some of my writings, but when we talk about native and non-native teachers, and we immediately tend to have this association. We tend to associate the native speaker with a monolingual speaker. Somebody who comes from Britain or the US, they're monolinguals. They come and they know nothing about the local culture. They know. Many cases this is not true, because many native teachers teaching in Japan speak Japanese. They've lived in Japan, so they are actually and they've become bicultural at least, right? Whereas many non-native teachers, in my context, Catalonia, may have been born, lived, studied in Catalonia. They are multilingual. They may speak Catalan, Spanish, and English, but I wouldn't say they are as multicultural, maybe as so. Language and culture are connected, but they are not the same thing. I would say monolingual could be multicultural. Yeah, sure.
Right.
It's probably easier if you are multilingual, because you have more chances of encountering diversity of people.
That's true.
Do you think in some situations there is a desire for teachers to remain monolingual? So, for example, in the book Native-Speakerism in Japan, there is a quote from a Japanese university professor who says that they want to replace their native-speaking teachers every few years, because if they stay in the country for too long, they become kind of they lose their purity.
Right, and that's very much an example of this ideologized or this idealized vision of the native speaker. When people think, we want native speakers, and then they think, as has been said by some authors, normally it doesn't count whether they are native or not. It has to be native that have a certain image. So they have to look Caucasian. They have to look, white, but not only white. Sort of Northern European kind of type, right? Even blonde or blue-eyed, better, right? So there's all these kind of associations with the identity, and then one of the associations is that they have to be pure, uncontaminated, and this is very, very strongly associated with a monolingual ideology that has been sort of in societies and in language itself, in linguistics. So this idea of the pure monolingual native speaker, that's the one we want. So based on this, then they say, if you are in a country like after 3-4 years, you are no longer pure monolingual. You haven't just arrived. You are too much contaminated by the local environment, which is absurd. It's ridiculous, because you are a much richer, much more, much better prepared person to teach than when you arrive. But this is part of this myth that I think it's damaging the whole situation. It's hurting non-native speakers, but it's hurting also native speakers in a way, in a different way, but also because it's sort of reducing them to this idealized, much like people might be reducing certain women to certain type of or men to certain type of men, and you can do certain things but not others.
So you kind of talked about this struggle as a mediated space in your talk yesterday.
There was a quote from an author, David Reyes, who talked about the importance of teacher training to help create this mediated space. Because it was like, how do you develop intercultural competence? Well, it can be traveling, but also it can be teacher training is important, I think, and teacher training should make specific focus on this.
Right, I see.
And so, in your professional life, how have you seen, the situation concerning the conception of the native speaker, the use of English as a lingua franca or native speaker models? How have you seen that change?
In professional life, I think that in academia, in research, there's been a big change. From being a very much sort of minority area, sort of, I wouldn't say very few people talked about that. It's a lot of native speakers were around, but they weren't considered relevant for research, and now there's a lot of research on that. there are books published, but also whenever people talk about language teaching, English language teaching, I mean, there's always at some point they need to make reference to English as lingua franca, or also non-native teachers' roles. So I think that this is quite a change from, let's say, 15, 20 years ago.
Right.
For sure.
Yeah. You say in academia. Do you think that that's filtered down at all to?
Yeah, right. That was the second part of it. Yeah, I forgot about it. Yeah. So, but when it comes to the practitioners, teachers, well, it's little by little filtering down into them. But I think it's still a long way to go, and that's regard this as one of my goals, to help in a way change the perceptions of teachers. I think there's still a lot of teachers who regard themselves, or either they feel some kind of complex of inferiority because they regard themselves as learners, they are still learning, or some when they feel they have succeeded, they speak well the language, that they are like, okay, now I'm the custodian, I'm the one who has to transfer these native speaker values onto the next generation, and I think they are missing the point of the whole thing.
Right. Yeah. And so maybe just to wrap up, so we're here at the Native-Speakerism Symposium. What do you hope will be achieved by having events like this?
Well, I think it's awareness is an important element. So discussion of these topics, it's raising awareness, is making us all together think about this, helping us, defining what we mean. I think that native speakerism is quite a recent concept. Was first brought up by Adrian Holiday just a few years ago. I think, and it's bringing in this into discussion. There has been research on non-native teachers from for a little longer, but the English lingua franca is there, and it helps us clarify concepts, set our minds, maybe help people decide that this is a nice place to be, a nice area to work on. I think that's part of having this dialogue. It's important.
Okay, yes, perhaps we'll end it there. So thank you very much for being interviewed by us today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed very much this conversation.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to both of our interviews today. We are very grateful to Stephanie and Enric for agreeing to take part and for their insightful responses to our questions. We'll be back next time with a regular episode. We hope you join us, and thank you, as always, for your support.